So that's the free will defense. And atheists have conceded, the atheist philosophers have generally conceded that this free will defense refutes the logical problem of evil. And they've shifted over to the probabilistic problem of evil, which is a little bit different, where they say it's just unlikely. Now, there's a few responses we can make. First is, on the probabilistic problem of evil, we have to also consider the other arguments for God's existence. And if they're weighty enough, they could outweigh the improbability, on the problem of evil side. You could say, problem of evil makes it improbable that God exists, but hey, if we just looked at evil, we probably would conclude that God doesn't exist. But what if we look at other things, like the evidence for God's existence? That so like a classic example that Bill Craig uses, William Lane Craig uses, is like, here's this guy Joe. Joe is a college student. 90% of college students drink. What are the odds that Joe drinks? 90%. But Joe goes to this school. I forgot what school he says. And this school has a strict no alcohol policy, and he's the president of the BCM. It's a Christian school. What are the odds now that Joe drinks? Well, that would definitely make a difference. Okay, so like if you just look at evil and you say, does God exist? You would conclude that God doesn't exist. It's unlikely that God exists. But what if you look at the evidence for God's existence? And then also the point is what if you look at the good in the world? Is there enough good to outweigh the evil? Well, it's hard for us to put a real number on that, but generally speaking, most humans believe life is good enough that it's worth living. They don't want to give up on life, that life's not so bad that it's just not worth it. And if so there's a lot of good too. So then that all that good that makes life worth living seems to be, has to be included somehow in part of your overall assessment. You know what I mean? So it's like, and then there's this added question that we just talked about of the long-term strategy of God. How can we possibly assess that? We can't. We cannot assess that. There's no way we could ever really know God's ultimate long-term strategy for why he allowed something bad to happen. And it may seem stupid today, but God's got a plan. You know what I mean? So the point of Job is there's so much you don't know. And then God says, but your friends, they were wrong about the karma thing. Because the karma thing is super simplistic. Okay? Now, there's also an emotional, so let's talk about some tactics of some tactical questions of dealing with the problem of evil when it comes up, because my belief is that in Christian apologetics, when the problem of evil does come up, you need to nip it in the bud. It needs to be dealt with quickly. So if someone is really pressing it and they're not all that emotional, they're more confident and they think they're right, what I find always works is just say, all right, let's say you were God, what would you do? What would you do different? And then maybe they would have some ideas. But then you say all right, would you take away human free will to do evil or good? And I've never had anyone say in a serious way, oh yeah, I definitely would do that. Because most people really, they recognize if I want God to do that to me, then because if I was God and I would do that, then that means I want God to do that to me because I'm not God. And that means I want God to do that to me. Or if I wish God was here, taking away my free will. I don't know. Free will seems like a great good. I don't know that I really see it that way. So, so there's that. Sometimes I find that's the best way to respond. there's also sort of an emotional side to this when something really, really bad happens. And I remember a few years back, this lady in my church, she was up there giving her testimony, and there were a bunch of people in the church like giving their testimonies, and her testimony involved the fact that her mama died, I think, in a car wreck, and she was really upset about it, and like crying, and like seriously, she was upset, and it was really, she didn't seem like she really had any answers, and like she said she looked to the Bible for answers for why God, did this, why God allowed this, and she's like, I didn't find any, like really upset that she didn't find the explanation. And if you follow everything I've said to this point, it's like, yeah, duh, that we can't possibly comprehend why God does these things, what God's long-term goal is. Like, it might not have anything to do with your life. It might go beyond all of our lives to something far bigger, or like, we just have to see. But like, that doesn't really, when someone's like crying and like their mama died, I don't think all of this philosophical stuff about Epicurus and Augustine and, David Hume and like an album plan to go, it's probably not the best way to tactically approach that. A different tactical approach would just be this. In Christianity, God suffered too. In fact, and if you have to be careful tactically, but like, I don't know that you should say this, but it is the truth. It's just that the level of suffering that Jesus underwent is the full weight of all human evil. So it's incomprehensible to us. Jesus suffered more than you did. So it's not like God's just not... Instead of God, you're saying, I wish God had prevented this bad thing from happening to me and to my people and, to humans. God's response is like, oh, I suffered way more than you, can possibly comprehend. And so the thing about that is it's like, why did God suffer more than we can possibly comprehend? Because we're evil. And then it kind of makes you think like, well, maybe the important thing is the fact that Jesus suffered. That's way worse than mine. And there's something about suffering, like, and when bad things happen to you, when something, no matter how bad you feel for yourself, there's a tendency when you see even worse things happening to somebody else to like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not doing as bad as that guy, you know what I mean? And you feel sorry for that guy. To say that God suffered more because of our evil makes us raise this whole other question of like, maybe God's sitting back saying, why didn't you prevent all the evil things that you did that I had to suffer for? You could have not done all those evil things, but like, that's a little bit of a rhetorical strategy. Another rhetorical strategy is just that the problem of evil, and this is, I think, our last point. The problem of evil is a problem for every religion, and even atheism. So, like, specifically, it is a criticism against, theism or classical theism, or this concept of like a big, all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God. And if you're trying to prove God doesn't exist, or it's unlikely that God exists, then you are carrying the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on you, the atheist, in this situation. If you're just going to say, well, I don't shoulder the burden of proof, well, then you didn't... what are you even saying at that point? Like, you didn't prove anything. You're just saying... At that point, you're just saying, I guess, a really, really, really weak version of the problem of evil where God might not exist because there's evil. You're like, okay, God might not exist, and now here's my evidence for God's existence, so God exists. That's not the problem of evil. The problem of evil is saying, on the logical side, is saying there's no way God exists, And on the probability side of saying it's incredibly unlikely that God exists because the level of evil in the world, there's too much of it, and or the types of evil, there's too much of it. And they go into detail about how they make that case, and which is something we didn't do for this video. But like, so anyway, the thing about that is it's a problem for atheism too, because the reverse of it is like, if evil exists, then there are objective moral values and duties, and it's just what you run into is just the moral argument for God's existence. There are objective moral values and duties, given that there is evil in the world. So then you can conclude the argument and say, objective moral values and duties can only exist if God exists, therefore God exists. So evil becomes powerful evidence that there are objective moral values and duties, and then those can only exist if God exists, so therefore God exists. So for atheists, what they have to do is be amazingly non-committal and say, oh, all I'm saying is that, like, if you, they can't criticize theism and belief in a God. They have to criticize like a specific concept of God, like a Christian God, for example. They could say, well, you're a Christian, right? I'm a Christian. But then you believe in a good God and you believe in evil. Yeah, well, you can't have it. So your God doesn't exist. And they have to say there's just a logical contradiction within your Christian system. It's self-destructive and self-refuting. That's a very different thing from saying, like, evil does exist and therefore God doesn't. Okay? But that kind of non-committal attitude you get from some atheists who don't want to have to defend a position on anything is just like kind of ridiculous, because the bottom line is evil does exist, and so the existence of evil, just like it's a problem for Christianity because evil does exist, it's a problem for atheism. Because if evil exists, then objective moral values and duties exist, and objective moral values and duties exist if and only if God exists, so therefore God exists. And they haven't really provided any kind of defense on that. They don't really have a great way out of that argument. They don't have anything like this free will defense we've talked about. Just to be non-committal about everything, which is what you get from like some internet atheists like Matt Dillahunty. When this guy talks, even when he's just by himself talking to the camera, it seems like he's the most non-committal guy ever. It's like, are you willing to defend any position on anything? Or are you just gonna make sure that you put maybe in front of like everything, and could be in front of everything, so that you don't ever have to defend anything? It's like, can't you just admit that there's evil and that this is a problem for atheism, just like it's a problem for Christianity? It's also a problem for Hinduism and Islam, and it's a problem for Islam, it's a problem for Judaism. In Hinduism, there's different forms of Hinduism. So you have like atheistic Hinduism, monotheistic Hinduism, polytheistic Hinduism, many gods. But you also have, and the main one, I think this is the biggest one, is pantheistic Hinduism. And in pantheistic Hinduism, it's like, okay, there's this ultimate oneness, the Brahman, not to be confused with the god Brahma, but the Brahman. And the Brahman entered into a state of forgetfulness, and throughout all of that became all of the creatures and the gods and the many, many gods of Hinduism, and even down to animals and all living things. And what we're here to do is achieve something called Atman Siddhi, where we get out of the cycle of karma and reincarnation by paying for all of our bad karma and stop being bad, so that you don't add up new bad karma. And that's very difficult. It seems like no matter how good you are, you always do something bad. So you'll never get back to Atman Siddhi, But the idea is that you'll be reincarnated in another life as like a cow, if you're really good, or maybe a Hindu priest and then a cow after that. But like, the problem is in Hinduism, it's like, where does Adolf Hitler come from? Adolf Hitler is God. We're all God. It's just God in a state of forgetfulness about how perfect he was. It's like, whoa. So in Hinduism, the problem of evil seems far worse, because now instead of preventing evil, God is Hitler. God is causing evil. In Buddhism, you got kind of a different form, because Buddha, his whole goal was to get out of the cycle of karma and reincarnation by coming to enlightenment and realizing that you don't exist. And if you don't exist, once you truly understand that, then you become a Buddha yourself, and you achieve the nirvana state, and you're enlightened, and you can't suffer anymore. And the problem with that is that, given human evil, suffering seems just. It doesn't seem right to just get out of it. Buddha didn't seem to consider the possibility that, like, hey, it's actually, don't you want there to be punishment for sin and evil when humans actually do it? Just to get out of it in this way, through this process. What about atonement? And then, since Buddha was an atheist, because he didn't just believe that you and I don't exist, nobody exists. So, including God doesn't exist. And then you run into real problems of, like, well, where does evil come from then? And who did it if nobody did it? And how can there be such a thing as evil? And especially, the moral argument for God's existence arises, and it's like, well, since evil does exist, doesn't God exist, And you believe in karma and reincarnation and this whole bad cycle that you can get out of, but, like, where'd that come from? No answer there. So, anyway, I think that's all we need to say for this video. And it was long, but it could have been longer, I guess. Hopefully we've dealt with the biggest objection to God's existence. We dealt with it well enough for us, for our purposes. Thank you so much. Have a lovely, lovely day. It might be helpful for us to think about a theodicy. And this example, I don't know where it originates, but I'll tell you where I saw it. I saw it on a science fiction / comedy sitcom. It's a British show called Red Dwarf. And it actually, the lead character is an atheist, but they kind of did a little work on thinking about a theodicy in one of the episodes. This is a TV show where in the future humans have begun to explore space on this huge spaceship called Red Dwarf, and there's a vending machine repairman named David Lister, and he gets in trouble because he brings a cat on the ship, a pet cat, and anyway, he has to go into stasis, which means they stop time for him for a little while. Well, it turns out something horrible breaks out on the ship and everyone dies. And the ship computer keeps him in stasis for 3 million years. The computer wakes him up 3 million years later, and as far as he knows, he's the last human in existence. And now he explores the galaxy, this assistant vending machine repairman, and there's all kinds of other life forms and things that he interacts with, but they're always things that, they're never like real aliens. They're like things made by humans in some way, or derived from humans in some way. Like his cat meets up with other cats in the ship, and over the course of 3 million years, they evolve into a race of humanoid cat people. And then they all die out, and there's only one of them left. But one of the types of creatures that they run into are these things called the simulants, and they're like half human, half robot, and they're like psychopathic murderer killers. Okay, And on one episode, him and his crew, he's got like a robot maid, and then he's got a holographic human that the computer brings back as a hologram, who was his boss uh, when he was alive. And they're trying to escape this psychopathic killing cyborg, and they go to an old prison floating in space that who knows when it was built. And you enter into the prison, and the prison is called the Justice Zone, and it has this thing called the Justice Field, and who knows how it works? It's sci-fi, but like the Justice Field, if you do in the Justice Field, if you do something bad happens to anyone that does anything bad to you. So like they test it out, and Rimmer tries to set Lister's. The hologram guy tries to set Lister's bed on fire, and instead of the bed catching on fire, Rimmer's like butt catches on fire. He catches on fire, and so that's how the Justice Field works. You can't do anything bad in the Justice Field. It's as soon as you do something bad happens to you. So you just would never do anything bad. And in fact, the psychopathic killer cyborg tries to kill Lister, and he's like, "Go ahead, fire away," and the bullets turn around and kill the cyborg, and the more he tries to kill Lister, the more he dies. And I think that makes a good point about the problem of evil, because, and that's the point they were trying to make in the episode, is like, if we lived in a perfectly fair world where if you did something bad happened to you, and we could say, alternatively, if you did something good happened to you, and it was immediate and instant like that, like instant karma. Karma's not instant. In Hinduism, it takes time. It can be in your next life, or you could be suffering from something from a past life. But if it was truly an instant karma world, like they imagine on this episode of Red Dwarf, then we wouldn't really have the freedom to choose to be good or evil in that world, because as soon as you do something bad, you would just never do anything bad in that world. No one would ever do anything bad. We live in an unfair world. The real world is a world where if you do something bad, you might get away with it, and if you do something good, no one may care, and you might not get rewarded. Which means in our world, you're free to do what you believe in. Of course, you think about rewards, and of course, you think about consequences, but there's totally a possibility that like you could do something bad and get away with it, which leaves us open to really think about, who do I really want to be good or bad for the sake of being good or bad, as opposed to just thinking about the consequences. Anyway, that's just a little bit of thinking about a theodicy here at the tail end here that I thought might be healthy.